All right, welcome back for another deep dive. We like to get into it here, so let's just jump right into today's topic.
So today we're looking at ontological commitment,
Ontological commitment.
which is sort of meta-ontology, stepping back from, what exists
Right.
to ask, well, what does it mean for a theory to be committed to something's existence?
Right. So not just what is, but sort of like how we figure out what a theory is even saying is.
Exactly, yeah. What are the tools we use to figure out what a theory is saying about what there is?
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at, as you might guess, a lot of different philosophers have had a lot of different things to say about this. We've got a lot of sources.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we can break down like the different approaches that people have taken to this question of what a theory commits us to ontologically.
And this is, for you, the listener, this is really fundamental stuff.
Yeah.
As a philosopher, you want to know not just the content of a theory, but like what that theory is really saying.
Yeah, like what kind of assumptions, sometimes hidden, are going into this theory. Before we can even evaluate whether the theory is like true or false or good or bad, we need to know like what's it actually saying.
Right. What are the ground rules? What are the base assumptions?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's get into it. So Quine kind of looms large over this topic.
Yeah, he's kind of like the starting point for a lot of contemporary discussion. Since the mid-20th century, his criterion for ontological commitment has really become the dominant one, like the orthodox view.
Okay, and he had a couple of things that he was going for, like why he was trying to develop this?
Yeah, so he had, I think, like two main roles that he saw as playing. One is as a way of measuring the ontological cost of a theory. So like how much, like how many what kind of weird entities does your theory commit you to? And, that could be useful for choosing between theories. If one theory is like, oh, well, it only commits you to, like physical objects, whereas this other theory commits you to like, numbers and properties and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe we prefer the simpler theory.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, as a way of critiquing theories, sort of like showing what they're really committed to.
Right.
And Church's use of Quine's criterion against like Eyre and Pat and Ryle is a good example of that, right? He's like, you guys think you're not committed to like these abstract entities, but actually your theory like secretly does commit you to them.
Gotcha.
So those are two main roles.
Okay, so those are like the motivations. That's why he's going for this.
Yeah.
But what's the core idea? Like how does it actually work?
So the core idea, I think, can be kind of summed up in this passage from his On What There Is, where he says, like a theory is committed to those entities which its bound variables must be capable of referring to for the theory to be true.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you have a statement like there exists an X such that X is an electron,
Right.
For that to be true, there has to be something that that variable X can refer to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That is an electron. So that theory commits you to electrons.
Okay, so it's really about the scope of the quantifiers, right? Like what are the variables ranging over?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a distinction that I think is really important, and that's the difference between ontological commitment and what you called ideological commitment. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so ontological commitment is, what a theory says exists.
Okay.
Ideological commitment is the concepts that the theory is able to express. And those are kind of independent.
Right.
So, for example, a physical theory might be ontologically committed to, like all the fundamental particles, but its concepts might not include all the possible properties that those particles could have. Or, conversely, you could have a very complex ethical theory with lots of different concepts, but it might not add anything to its basic ontological commitments. It might just be committed to people and actions.
Right.
So there's been this sort of growing trend towards emphasizing ideological commitment.
Right.
But we're going to focus on ontological commitment today.
Gotcha.
So we're going to be looking at, what a theory says exists.
Right. Now, I want to kind of pin down a little bit what we mean by theory. I think it's easy to kind of be loosey-goosey with this.
Yeah. And this is, especially in the context of like Quine's work and a lot of the work that's been done on ontological commitment. By theory, we usually mean an interpreted theory, and particularly when we're working in a formal language, like first-order logic, the interpretation comes from, Tarskian semantics.
Yeah.
Where, like, the predicates are assigned extensions, which is like, the set of things that they're true of.
Right.
And the quantifiers are understood objectively, so they're, ranging over objects in some domain.
Right.
And the domain of the quantifiers, it's not like it's fixed.
Yeah.
When we talk about ontological commitment, we often think about different possible domains.
Yeah.
And like what the theory requires for it to be true in those domains.
Okay, so it's not just like a string of symbols. It's like those symbols like interpreted with respect to like potential things in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, so theories, we've got handle on that, but like what kinds of things are theories committed to?
Yeah, so sometimes it's very specific things like, if I say there exists an X such that X is Socrates,
right?
Then obviously that's committed to Socrates.
Yeah.
Right. But often, and I think more interestingly, philosophically, it's a commitment to kinds of things.
Okay.
Like, universals, numbers, electrons.
Okay.
So if I say there exists an X such that X is an elephant.
Right.
That commits me to elephants.
Okay.
It doesn't commit me to any particular elephant.
Right.
But it says, like, look, for this theory to be true, there's got to be at least one elephant out there.
Gotcha. And this K or a kind, that's kind of interpreted broadly in this framework, right?
Yeah, it is. It can include, negative kinds, like non-electron disjunctive kinds, like electron or chair.
Right.
And even, like very specific groupings, like, being identical to a particular thing.
Okay.
So it's a very broad notion of kind.
Okay, so let's get into like Quine's, his criterion. And he started with this extensional version, right?
Yeah, so the initial extensional version was basically that an existential quantification presupposes objects of a kind if the open sentence following the quantifier is true of some objects of that kind and none, not of that kind.
Okay.
So there exists an X such that X is an elephant commits you to elephants because, the open sentence X is an elephant is true of all and only elephants, and there are elephants.
Okay, yeah, that seems pretty straightforward, right? Like if it's a true existential.
Yeah.
The problem comes, as I recall, like when we start talking about like false existentials.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when we apply this to false existential sentences, like there exists an X such that X is a centaur.
Yeah.
The problem is there are no centaurs. So the open sentence X is a centaur is true of no objects of any kind.
Right, yeah, there are no centaurs. So it's not true of any centaurs because there aren't any.
Exactly. And the same would go for there exists an X such that X is a unicorn.
Right.
And in fact, it would go for any false existential.
Right.
So they would all end up having the same ontological commitment, namely none.
Right. But intuitively, like it seems like saying there are centaurs is different from saying there are unicorns.
Exactly. So this version of the criterion, it just can't distinguish between different false existentials.
Yeah. Okay. So this extensional version kind of runs into some problems. What's the next move?
Yeah, so the next move is to kind of revise the extensional criterion to what we might call the extensional version of Quine's criterion, which is a theory T is ontologically committed to Ks if and only if every domain of quantification that makes T true contains at least one K.
Okay, so we've kind of shifted from looking at just like a single statement like there exists an X.
Yeah.
Now we're looking at like the theory as a whole and like what domains of quantification like make that whole theory true.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, and does this solve the false existential problem?
It addresses some of the problems, right?
Yeah.
Because, now we're talking about like the truth of the theory in different domains, including possibly, empty domains.
Right.
But the core problem with this extensional version is that it still can't handle coextensional kinds.
Coextensional, so that means like two kinds that have the same extension.
Yeah, so like centaurs and unicorns.
Okay.
In the actual world, there are no centaurs and there are no unicorns. So like the kind centaur and the kind unicorn have the same extension, namely the empty set.
Right, yeah, okay.
So even with this revised extensional criterion, there exists an X such that X is a centaur, and there exists an X such that X is a unicorn. They still end up having the same ontological commitments.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we can't just stick with this purely extensional approach. What did Quine do to try to resolve this?
So what Quine does is he advocates what he calls semantic assent.
Okay.
So he wants to move the discussion to the metalinguistic level.
Okay.
So instead of talking about like, centaurs, we talk about the word centaur. Okay.
And the idea is that the the ontological commitment to a kind K has to involve the predicate K itself. So the commitment to centaurs is different from the commitment to unicorns because the predicates centaur and unicorn are different, even if they both happen to apply to nothing in reality.
So instead of analyzing the ontological commitment of centaurs exist, we analyze the properties of the sentence, centaurs exist.
Exactly. Yeah, we move up to the level of language.
Okay, so this semantic ascent allows us to talk about these commitments without, like, endorsing the ontology of the person we're talking to.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, we're not saying, oh, yeah, we believe in centaurs.
Right.
But we can still analyze, like, what it would mean to be committed to centaurs.
Yeah, and we can say, like, look, we're not committed to centaurs, but we are committed to this predicate centaur.
Right, gotcha. Okay, so that's Quine's kind of solution. But this metalinguistic move, it still kind of leaves open the question of, like, what's the criterion for determining ontological commitment? Yeah, and in fact, the version of the criterion that I think has really taken hold in, like, subsequent philosophical work is actually, it goes in a modal direction.
Okay. So we're moving from, like, what is the case to what must be the case.
Yeah, exactly. So the criterion that we might call the modal entailment criterion is that a theory T is ontologically committed to Ks if and only if, for every possible world WT is true at W, only if the domain of W contains at least one K. So basically, it's saying that the theory necessarily implies the existence of at least one K.
Okay, I think I'm following. So, it doesn't matter whether the theory is true in the actual world, but, like, in any possible world where the theory is true, it has to have at least one of these Ks.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Okay. Now, how does this modal entailment criterion deal with the false existential problem that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so it handles false existentials really nicely. So the statement, there exists an X such that X is a unicorn, is committed to unicorns. Because in any possible world where that sentence is true, there has to be a unicorn in the domain of that world.
Right. So we're not just saying, in this world, unicorns don't exist. We're saying, look, if you're going to have a world where that sentence is true, then unicorns have to exist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether, the person proposing this theory, like, believes in unicorns or not.
Right.
That's a separate question.
Gotcha. So the commitment is not just to, like, whether it's true here and now, but, like, what are the conditions for it being true in any possible world?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, but as I recall, this criterion, kind of nice as it is, it also runs into some problems, especially when we're talking about, like, things that exist necessarily.
Yeah, so the problem here is that a lot of things that, philosophers debate about, like numbers or universals, are often thought to exist necessarily.
Right.
So if they exist at all, they exist in every possible world. And the problem for the modal entailment criterion is that if something exists in every possible world, then any theory that happens to be true in any possible world will entail the existence of that thing.
Right.
So basically every theory, no matter what it's about, is going to be committed to, like, numbers.
Yeah, it seems a little too broad. Right?
Yeah, it's way too broad.
Like, if I'm talking about, like, cellular biology.
Right.
I don't want to be committed to the number pi.
Exactly, yeah. No one thinks that, like, a theory of biology should commit you to all of mathematics.
Yeah.
So that's a problem.
Okay, so how do philosophers deal with that?
So the main move here is to get more specific about the modal requirement.
Okay.
So we move to what we might call the modal quantifier criterion.
Okay.
And this criterion says that a theory T is committed to Ks if and only if, for every possible world W, in every subdomain of the domain at W, T is true at W, with its variables ranging only over that subdomain, only if that subdomain contains at least one K. Okay, so now we're not just saying, does it exist in any world where the theory is true? We're saying, does it exist in any relevant part of any world where the theory is true?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're getting more local, more fine-grained about the modal requirement.
Okay. And how does this solve the problem of, being committed to everything?
Yeah, so this handles the irrelevant necessary existence problem because, now if a theory can be true, even when we restrict our attention to, like, a part of a world that doesn't include, numbers, for example, then the theory is not committed to numbers.
Right.
So, like, if we have a theory about fruit fly behavior, that theory can be true even if we only look at, like, the parts of the world that involve fruit flies.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we're kind of narrowing down the scope of what the modal entailment has to range over.
Yeah, that exactly right.
But as I recall, even this refined modal quantifier criterion,
Yeah.
it still has some issues. It does. I mean, we can't,
Yeah.
we can't get rid of all the problems. So one of the problems is that, just like the extensional criteria had trouble with co-extensional kinds, right? Like centaurs and unicorns.
Right, yeah.
The modal criteria have trouble with co-intentional kinds.
So co-intentional, like they're necessarily equivalent.
Yeah, so like triangular and trilateral.
Okay.
So if I'm committed to triangular polygons, I'm automatically committed to trilateral polygons and vice versa, because it's necessarily true that a polygon is triangular if and only if it's trilateral.
Right, okay.
And the same problem would arise with, like round squares and even prime numbers greater than 2.
Okay, yeah. So if you've got like two concepts that are necessarily, equivalent coextensive,
Yeah.
then the modal criterion is going to say like, well, you're committed to both of them.
Yeah.
Even if it seems like conceptually they should be different.
Yeah, and we might think like, well, those should have different ontological implications. But the modal criterion can't distinguish between them.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's one problem with the modal quantifier criterion. What are some other problems?
So another problem is that metaphysically impossible theories, so theories that are, true in no possible world,
Okay.
end up being committed to every kind of entity.
Right.
So, for example, naive set theory, which leads to Russell's paradox and all that,
Yeah.
that would be committed not just to sets, but also to talking donkeys and, all sorts of other things.
Show everything.
Yeah, which seems weird.
Right, because if it's false, then it's vacuously committed to,
Yeah.
like, everything.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, that's weird. Okay, so that's another problem. And I think you said there's even, like, a third one.
Yeah, so the third problem is that necessary connections between different kinds of entities can lead to what we might call spurious commitments. So, like whales are necessarily mammals.
Right.
So if I'm committed to the existence of whales, I'm automatically committed to the existence of mammals.
Right.
Even if my theory, like, explicitly denies the existence of mammals.
Yeah.
Which seems odd.
Right, yeah, okay.
And you get a similar problem with, like, metaphysically necessary identities.
Right.
Like, Hesperus is phosphorus.
Right.
So if I'm committed to Hesperus, am I automatically committed to phosphorus?
Yeah.
Even if, like, my theory is talking about them in different ways.
Right.
So those are some problems with the modal criteria.
Okay, so, I mean, it seems like the general issue is that, like, metaphysical necessity, which is a powerful tool, is maybe just a little too blunt to deal with, like, the subtleties of ontological commitment.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't make all the distinctions that we want to make.
Right.
And this has led some philosophers to say, like, okay, well, maybe we need a different kind of entailment relation.
Okay.
Or, maybe we need to supplement the modal notion with something else.
Yep.
So one idea is to, replace metaphysical necessity with a priori entailment.
Okay.
So, like, what's conceptually necessary?
Okay, so, like, it's not that, in every metaphysically possible world it's
Right.
true, but, like, given our concepts, it has to be true.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not ranging over all metaphysically possible worlds.
Right.
We're ranging over conceptually possible worlds.
Okay.
But that doesn't solve all the problems.
Right, because, like, triangular and trilateral,
Yeah, that's still a problem.
like, that's conceptually necessary.
Yeah, that's still a problem. And inconsistent theories are still going to entail everything.
Right.
So, some people have gone even further and said, okay, well, maybe we need, like, relevant entailment.
Okay.
Or, maybe we need to move to a pair-consistent logic where we can actually reason about impossible worlds.
Gotcha.
Or, maybe we just need to drop modality altogether.
Right.
And just talk about non-modal entailment.
Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways that we can tweak this criterion.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to note that, like, some people who like the modal account have said, look, these problems aren't really problems with the modal account. They're problems with, like, misunderstanding what ontological commitment is.
Yeah. So the idea here is that, like, maybe we're confusing the ontological commitments of a theory with the ontological beliefs of the person who accepts the theory.
Okay.
So, like, I might accept a theory that has certain ontological commitments.
Yeah.
without realizing it.
Without realizing it, okay.
And, that might be perfectly rational, but it does kind of raise the question of like, well, why should we care about ontological commitment?
Right. Yeah. If it's not something that like the person like is consciously endorsing,
Yeah.
then it's not clear like why it should be a guide to, like evaluating theories or choosing between them.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an interesting response, but I think it leaves some questions unanswered.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a lot about like the quantifier account, the modal version, but I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and evaluate these accounts in general.
Okay.
And so the first question is, are they sufficient?
Yeah.
Like, do they capture all the ontological commitments that a theory has?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there are a few things to say about that.
Okay.
So one issue that came up early on, it's not so much an objection to the criterion itself as an objection to the logic that we're using to analyze the criterion.
Okay.
So standard first-order logic traditionally doesn't allow for empty domains.
Okay.
So there has to be something in the domain of quantification.
Right.
And this has the consequence that universal sentences have existential import.
Okay.
So if I say for all x, x is f,
Yeah.
that implies that there exists at least one x.
Okay.
Because, the domain can't be empty.
Mm.
And this means that, if we're using the quantifier criterion, then universal sentences and existential sentences are going to have the same ontological commitment.
Okay.
But we might want to allow for universal sentences to be true even if there are no objects.
Yeah.
Like if the domain is empty.
Right.
So that's a problem.
Yeah.
And the solution that people have come up with is to use inclusive logic.
Okay.
Which does allow for empty domains.
Right.
So in inclusive logic, a universal sentence can be true and an existential sentence can be false in an empty domain.
Okay. So like we're tweaking the underlying logic to kind of better match like what we want the criterion to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
We're making the logic more sensitive to the distinction between universal and existential quantification.
Gotcha. Now, another thing that comes up is the distinction between substitutional and objectual quantification.
Yeah.
Can you kind of remind us what that is and why that matters for this discussion?
Yeah, so Quine, he was pretty clear that he intended an objectual interpretation of the quantifiers. So there exists an x such that x is f is true, if and only if there's some object in the domain that satisfies f.
Okay.
But if we interpret quantifiers substitutionally,
Okay.
then there exists an x such that x is f is true if and only if f of t is true for some term t in our language.
Okay.
And this can lead to what we might call an overgeneration of ontological commitments.
Right. Yeah. So it's not about the objects themselves anymore. It's about like the terms in our language.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so like you could end up being committed to things like Sherlock Holmes because we have a name for him.
Yeah, exactly. So I might say, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective, and if I interpret the quantifier substitutionally,
Right.
then that sentence is implicitly saying there exists an X such that X is Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
But, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. He's fictional.
Yeah. So that's a problem for the substitutional interpretation.
But Quine was like a staunch objectual quantification guy, right?
Yeah, and especially since he wanted like a canonical notation.
Right.
Where like the role of singular terms is kind of minimized.
Right.
So this substitutional objection, it only really works if you think that the objectual interpretation is somehow incoherent.
Right, or like reducible to a substitutional one.
Yeah, or that it's somehow grounded in the substitutional one.
Yeah, gotcha.
Which, Quine didn't think.
Right. So the objectual interpretation, helps to avoid that problem. Yeah. But what about like more fundamentally, like there's this view that says, look, quantifiers aren't about existence at all.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here about the Meinongian view, with the distinction between being and existence.
Yeah. So the Meinongian objection is that the quantifier there exists an X shouldn't be read as like there exists an X.
Yeah.
But rather is something like for some X. And they think that existence is a separate property.
Okay.
That some things have and some things don't. So there exists an X such that X is a dragon doesn't commit you to dragons. Or there exists an X such that X exists and X is a dragon commits you to dragons.
Gotcha.
So the idea is that we can quantify